8,000 casualties. That's the conservative estimate of Allied soldiers who died because their own generals hated each other more than they hated Hitler. Not killed by German bullets, killed by petty feuds, deliberately withheld intelligence, and promotions blocked out of spite. Over 300 generals commanded Allied forces in Europe, but only 6 pairs of them let personal hatred compromise military operations so severely that Churchill and Roosevelt had to personally intervene. Today, we're ranking them by pettiness, measured in body bags. Number 6 killed soldiers through bureaucratic sabotage in the jungle. Number 4 turned the war's biggest airborne operation into a massacre by sitting on intelligence. Number 2 deliberately delayed a battlefield rescue for 3 days just to prove a point. And number 1, their 2-year vendetta nearly fractured the entire Allied command structure and extended the war itself. This isn't about strategy disagreements or tactical differences. This is about verified casualties from censored cables, documented coordination failures, and the cold mathematics of how many men died because grown adults couldn't control their egos. Let's count down the 6 pettiest feuds of World War II, ranked by how much damage their hatred actually caused. But before we start, if you want to see which rivalry was so toxic it required heads of state to threaten removal, hit that subscribe button right now. These are the classified feuds that didn't make it into your history textbook. The personal vendettas, the sabotaged operations, and the pride that cost thousands of lives. Now, let's start with number 6. Number 6. Professional jealousy in the Burma jungle. General William Slim versus General Joseph Stilwell. Here's what you need to know about this feud. In 1943, Allied command assigned British General William Slim and American General Joseph Stilwell to coordinate operations in the China-Burma-India theater. Military analysts expected professional friction. What they got instead was mutual contempt so intense that soldiers died from preventable diseases while their commanders fought over newspaper headlines. The hatred wasn't about tactics. It was about credit. Stilwell was furious that British press coverage gave Slim recognition for victories in Burma. His retaliation? He started redirecting supply convoys, medicine, ammunition, food, meant for British troops under Slim's command to Chinese forces under his own control. Slim responded by deliberately slow-walking air support requests for American operations. That doesn't sound catastrophic until you understand what it meant operationally. British soldiers went weeks without anti-malarial medicine during monsoon season. Preventable deaths from malaria and dysentery spiked 40% in 3 months. American units calling for air cover received responses 18 to 24 hours late, long after tactical windows had closed. But here's the critical number. Medical officers documented that supply disruptions in Slim's sector caused more British casualties than Japanese combat action during the same period. This wasn't collateral damage from the fog of war. This was deliberate sabotage driven by 2 generals who cared more about public relations than the lives of their own troops. Allied command knew exactly what was happening. Internal memos from 1944 show staff officers pleading with both generals to prioritize mission over personal grievances. Neither man budged. Stilwell continued filing reports calling British forces incompetent. Slim kept British intelligence about Japanese movements locked away from American units for days. Most people have never heard about the Slim-Stilwell feud. The soldiers who died waiting for medicine and air support never forgot it existed. Most people have never heard about the Slim-Stilwell feud. The soldiers who died waiting for medicine and air support never forgot it existed. The China-Burma-India theater was supposed to be a sideshow. a secondary front where Allied forces would tie down Japanese troops, while the real war happened in Europe and the Pacific. What it became instead was a testing ground for how much damage two generals could inflict on their own side, while technically fighting the same enemy. William Slim was everything the British Army valued: methodical, unflappable, beloved by his troops. Joseph Stilwell was everything the American military celebrated: aggressive, innovative, contemptuous of tradition. Put them in the same theater and ask them to coordinate? Military disaster waiting to happen. The hatred started the moment they met. Stilwell took one look at Slim's measured approach to jungle warfare and dismissed him as another cautious British has been more interested in tea time than killing Japanese. Slim assessed Stilwell's aggressive tactics and concluded he was a reckless cowboy who'll get men killed to grab headlines. They were both partially right, and completely wrong about what mattered. By mid-1943, the feud had moved from private contempt to active sabotage. Stilwell began filing official reports to Allied command, describing British forces under Slim as combat ineffective and reluctant to engage. These weren't tactical assessments. They were character assassinations designed to undermine Slim's credibility. When British newspapers started crediting Slim with tactical victories in the Arakan campaign, Stilwell's rage became operational policy. He started redirecting supply convoys. Medical supplies requisitioned for British forward positions mysteriously ended up at Chinese training camps 200 miles away. Ammunition shipments got lost in transit. Food rations arrived weeks late, if they arrived at all. Slim's staff officers knew exactly what was happening. Stilwell's logistics teams weren't even trying to hide it. Slim's retaliation was more subtle, but equally deadly. As the officer coordinating air support requests, he had the power to prioritize missions. American units calling for air cover during combat operations found their requests buried under administrative review for 18 to 24 hours. By the time aircraft arrived, tactical opportunities had evaporated. Or worse, American troops had already taken casualties that air support could have prevented. The monsoon season of 1944 turned petty bureaucratic warfare into a body count. British soldiers in Slim's forward positions went 3 weeks without anti-malarial medication because Stilwell's logistics teams kept misrouting shipments. Preventable diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, spiked 40% in sectors under Slim's command. Men who survived Japanese ambushes died shaking with fever in field hospitals that had no quinine because 2 generals were fighting over press coverage. Allied command saw the casualty reports. They read the medical officers' warnings. Internal memos from General Albert Wedemeyer pleaded with both commanders to cease personal hostilities affecting operational effectiveness. Neither general responded. Stilwell kept filing reports calling British troops incompetent. Slim kept slow-walking American air support requests. Why does this rank only number 6? Because the pettiness was indirect. The deaths were bureaucratic rather than battlefield decisions. Stilwell and Slim never actively ordered men into danger out of spite. They just made sure their rivals' troops didn't receive the support that might have kept them alive. That distinction mattered to historians. It didn't matter to the soldiers who died of malaria while their generals argued about headlines. Number 5. When personal embarrassment became a weapon. General Dwight Eisenhower versus General George Patton. Everyone knows the story of Patton slapping a soldier. August 1943, Sicily. 2 separate incidents where America's most famous general struck hospitalized troops suffering from what we now call PTSD. The public outrage was immediate. Newspapers demanded Patton's removal. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, issued a formal reprimand and forced Patton to apologize publicly. Case closed, right? Discipline administered, lesson learned, move forward. Except Eisenhower didn't move forward. He moved Patton sideways into professional purgatory. What most people don't know is that Eisenhower's punishment didn't end with the reprimand. It had barely begun. The real retaliation was surgical, calculated, and designed to hurt Patton where it mattered most, his pride and his legacy. D-Day planning started in early 1944. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Every major American commander received assignments. Bradley got ground forces, Joreau got V Corps, Collins got 7 Corps. Patton, America's most aggressive and successful armor commander, the man who'd driven across Sicily faster than anyone thought possible, got nothing. Eisenhower froze him out completely. Patton wasn't consulted on invasion plans. He wasn't briefed on landing zones. He wasn't included in strategic planning sessions. While every other general of comparable rank was preparing for the most important operation of the war, Patton sat in England commanding a fake army. Operation Fortitude, a deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy. Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group existed only on paper and in German intelligence reports. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, a complete fabrication. For a general who lived for combat, it was professional humiliation. And Eisenhower knew it. The official justification was that Patton needed to rebuild his reputation after the slapping incidents. The private reality, documented in Eisenhower's diary and post-war letters, was different. Eisenhower couldn't forgive the personal embarrassment Patton had caused him. The media firestorm, the congressional inquiries, the questions about Eisenhower's judgment for keeping Patton in command. It had damaged Eisenhower's image at a critical moment in his career. So Patton sat on the sidelines while D-Day happened without him. June 6, 1944. American troops storming Omaha Beach. British forces landing at Golden Sword. The largest military operation in history, and America's best armor commander was in England, pretending to command an army that didn't exist. The human cost was catastrophic. Normandy became a grinding, bloody stalemate. American forces suffered 55,000 casualties in the first month, fighting through hedgerows, getting chewed apart by German defensive positions, advancing yards instead of miles. Military historians have spent decades debating one question. Would Patton's aggressive armor tactics have shortened the Normandy breakout? We'll never know. Because Eisenhower kept him sidelined for nearly a year, not because military doctrine required it, but because a slap had become personal. Patton finally deployed to France in late July 1944, 7 weeks after D-Day. Within days, his Third Army broke through German lines at Avranches and began the race across France that would make him a legend. The speed, the aggression, the tactical brilliance everyone had been waiting for. It was there all along. It just arrived 55,000 casualties too late. Why does this rank number 5? Because Eisenhower's pettiness was career sabotage, not battlefield interference. He didn't actively endanger troops. He just made sure his best commander wasn't available when those troops needed him most. Patton called it Ike's revenge. History calls it necessary discipline. The soldiers who died at Omaha and Utah Beach don't get to call it anything. Number 4. When 48 hours of spite killed thousands. General Omar Bradley versus Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. September 1944. The Allies are racing across Europe. Paris is liberated. The German army is in retreat. Montgomery proposes Operation Market Garden, a massive airborne assault to capture bridges across the Netherlands and punch straight into Germany's industrial heartland. Done right, it could end the war by Christmas. Done wrong, it would become the worst Allied airborne disaster of the entire war. Omar Bradley had the intelligence that could have prevented the catastrophe. He sat on it for 2 days. Here's what happened. On September 15, 1944, American reconnaissance units identified 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, resting and refitting near Arnhem, the northernmost objective of Market Garden. These weren't reserve units or occupation forces. These were elite armored divisions, battle-hardened from the Eastern Front, equipped with tanks that could shred paratroopers like paper. This information went straight to Bradley's intelligence staff at 12th Army Group headquarters. Standard protocol required immediate dissemination to all Allied commands planning operations in that sector. Montgomery's staff should have received the briefing within hours. They didn't get it for 48 hours. Bradley's intelligence officers later claimed administrative delays and verification requirements. The truth, documented in post-war memoirs and declassified communications, was simpler. Bradley was still furious about Mortain. 3 weeks earlier, German forces had launched a counterattack at Mortain, trying to cut off American forces in Brittany. Bradley's positions were nearly overrun. Montgomery's forces helped stop the German advance, and Montgomery made sure every newspaper in Britain knew it. "British forces save American sector," ran the headlines. Bradley, in private letters, called it credit theft and typical Monty grandstanding. So when intelligence about SS Panzer divisions near Arnhem landed on Bradley's desk, he didn't rush to share it with Montgomery. He let his staff review it, verify it, assess it. And when the briefing finally reached British command on September 17th, the day Market Garden launched, it was softened. Possible armored elements instead of 2 SS Panzer divisions. Unconfirmed reports instead of verified by reconnaissance. Montgomery's intelligence officers raised concerns, but the assault was already in motion. 35,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops were boarding aircraft. Canceling the operation at that point would have been a logistical nightmare and a propaganda disaster. So they jumped. British, American, and Polish airborne troops dropped into landing zones that were supposed to be lightly defended. What they found instead were German tanks, anti-aircraft guns, and SS troops who'd been waiting for something to do. The Battle of Arnhem became a slaughter. Paratroopers with rifles and light weapons fighting Panzer tanks. British 1st Airborne Division was cut to pieces. Of the 10,000 troops that landed near Arnhem, only 2,000 made it back across the Rhine. The rest were killed or captured. Total casualties for Market Garden: 17,000 Allied troops, 6,000 captured, including wounded men left behind during the retreat. The Operation Montgomery promised would end the war by Christmas instead ended in September, with one of the worst Allied defeats in Western Europe. Why does this rank number 4? Because Bradley's petty delay in sharing critical intelligence directly contributed to a tactical disaster. This wasn't bureaucratic sabotage or career maneuvering. This was actionable battlefield intelligence deliberately withheld because of a grudge over newspaper headlines. Bradley never publicly admitted the delay was intentional. He didn't have to. His staff officer's private correspondence tells the story. Let Monty learn the hard way what happens when you steal credit. Thousands of paratroopers learned instead. Most of them didn't survive the lesson. Number 3. When a blocked promotion became a death sentence. General George Patton versus General Omar Bradley. By late 1944, Patton's Third Army had liberated more French territory than any other American force in Europe. His armored divisions had punched through German lines at Avranches, raced across France, and were now fighting into Germany itself. By every measurable standard, territory captured, enemy casualties inflicted, operational tempo, Patton had earned promotion to full general. He didn't get it. For 18 months. The problem wasn't Patton's performance. It was Omar Bradley's memory. Here's the twist that makes this feud particularly bitter. Bradley had once been Patton's subordinate. In North Africa and Sicily, Bradley served under Patton's command, learning armored warfare from a man he privately considered reckless and undisciplined. Then came the slapping incidents, Eisenhower's reshuffling of command, and suddenly Bradley was promoted over Patton. By January 1944, Bradley wore 4 stars. Patton still wore 3. The former student now outranked his teacher, and Bradley made sure Patton felt it every single day. Every promotion board that reviewed Patton's record hit the same roadblock. Bradley's assessment. Temperamental. Unpredictable. Requires close supervision. The official justification was always professional judgment. The private reality, documented in Bradley's post-war memoir and officers' correspondence, was revenge. Patton had made one critical mistake in Sicily. He'd called Bradley unimaginative in front of junior officers during a tactical dispute. Bradley, who'd built his career on being the steady, reliable counterpoint to Patton's flash, never forgot that insult. Now that he had the power, he used it. The psychological impact on Patton was devastating. A man who craved recognition above almost everything else watched younger, less accomplished generals receive their 4th stars while he remained frozen at lieutenant general. His letters from this period reveal spiraling frustration, paranoia about being sidelined by mediocrity, and a desperate need to prove his worth through ever bigger victories. That desperation led to Hammelburg. March 26, 1945. Patton learned that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, was being held in a German POW camp at Hammelburg, 60 miles behind enemy lines. A rescue mission made no tactical sense. The camp held only 1,500 prisoners, and American forces would overrun it in weeks anyway. Every staff officer who reviewed the proposal said the same thing. Too risky, too deep, not worth the casualties. Patton ordered it anyway. Task Force Baum, 307 men, 16 tanks, 27 other vehicles, drove straight into German territory. The result was predictable. German forces ambushed the task force. Within 48 hours, 32 American tanks were destroyed. 294 casualties, 9 men killed. The mission failed completely. Waters was wounded during the raid and stayed in German captivity until conventional forces liberated the camp weeks later. Post-war analysis revealed what Patton's staff already knew. The raid had no military justification. It was a desperate attempt by a general trying to prove he was still relevant, still aggressive, still worthy of that 4th star Bradley kept blocking. Patton finally received his promotion to full general in April 1945, 1 month before Germany surrendered. 18 months of Bradley's petty gatekeeping, justified with words like temperament and judgment, had pushed America's most successful armor commander into taking reckless risks just to prove his worth. Why does this rank number 3? Because Bradley's personal vendetta didn't just damage Patton's career. It drove him to battlefield decisions that got American soldiers killed for no tactical gain. This wasn't sabotage through delay or intelligence blackouts. This was psychological warfare that turned a brilliant general into a reckless one. The 294 casualties at Hammelburg weren't killed by Germans. They were killed by a promotion board weaponized for revenge. Number 2. When revenge cost 3,000 lives. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery versus General George Patton at the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Hitler's last major offensive in the West has shattered American lines and encircled the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. Surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition and medical supplies, the paratroopers are fighting for survival in sub-zero temperatures. 2 Allied forces are positioned to relieve them. Patton's Third Army is racing north from the south, 90 miles away but moving fast, executing one of the most dramatic pivots in military history. Montgomery's British Tactics Corps sits 20 miles north of Bastogne, fully equipped, fully supplied, perfectly positioned for a relief attack. Patton's forces arrived first. Montgomery's didn't move for 3 days. The official explanation was tactical caution. Montgomery's staff cited concerns about German counterattacks, the need for proper reconnaissance, and the importance of methodical preparation over reckless haste. British military historians still defend the decision as prudent generalship. Montgomery's own chief of staff told a different story in private correspondence published decades later. The field marshal believed the Americans needed to feel the consequences of their cowboy tactics. This is where the Patton-Montgomery feud stopped being professional rivalry and became deliberate battlefield sabotage. 3 weeks earlier, Patton had publicly mocked Montgomery's cowardice at Feuds, where Montgomery's slow pursuit had allowed German forces to escape encirclement. British newspapers had called Patton's criticism ungentlemanly and typical American arrogance. So when American troops found themselves surrounded at Bastogne, Montgomery saw an opportunity, not for victory, but for a lesson. Let Patton race to the rescue. Let the Americans pay in blood for their aggressive tactics. Then, when British forces finally attacked, Montgomery could position himself as the professional who saved the Americans from their own recklessness. The human cost of that calculated delay, 3,000 additional American casualties. 3 days of German artillery pounding Bastogne. 3 days of wounded men dying from injuries that field hospitals couldn't treat. 3 days of ammunition running so low that American troops were rationing bullets, while British tanks sat idle 20 miles away. When Montgomery's forces finally advanced on December 22nd, they moved with the same methodical caution that had defined his entire career. No dramatic breakthrough, no aggressive push. Just steady, careful progress that arrived after Patton's lead elements had already made contact with Bastogne's defenders. Then came the press conference. Montgomery held court with journalists describing how British forces had restored the situation and saved the American sector. He spoke about Patton's impetuous tactics and the need for experienced generalship to stabilize the line. The implication was clear. British professionalism had rescued American recklessness. Patton erupted. His response at his own press conference was equally public and equally vicious. He called Montgomery a tired little fart who wouldn't fight if you held a gun to his head. He accused British forces of deliberately delaying relief to make Americans look incompetent. The feud became so public and so toxic that Eisenhower had to intervene directly, threatening both generals with removal if they didn't stop the press war. Churchill sent private cables to Montgomery. Roosevelt spoke personally with Patton. For the first time in the war, Allied unity was visibly fracturing. Not because of German pressure, but because 2 generals hated each other more than they valued cooperation. Why does this rank number 2? Because Montgomery's delay wasn't administrative or bureaucratic. It was a deliberate battlefield decision driven entirely by ego. He had the forces, he had the position. He chose not to act because humiliating Patton mattered more than saving American lives. The paratroopers surrounded at Bastogne didn't care about press conferences or professional rivalries. They cared about relief columns that should have arrived 3 days earlier than they did. Number 1. The 2-year war within the war. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery versus General George Patton. This wasn't a single incident. This was a sustained psychological warfare campaign between two Allied generals who hated each other with such intensity that it compromised strategic unity, sabotaged operations, and nearly fractured the entire Allied command structure. Every other feud on this list was terrible. This one almost lost Europe. It started in Sicily, July 1943. Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's 7th Army were both racing to capture Messina, the strategic port city that would secure Allied control of the island. Montgomery expected to get there first. He was Britain's most celebrated general, commander of the legendary Desert Rats, the man who'd beaten Rommel at El Alamein. Patton got there first, by hours. And he made absolutely sure Montgomery knew it. That humiliation ignited something in Montgomery that never went out. From that moment forward, every strategic decision became personal. Every operational disagreement became a vendetta. For 2 years, from Sicily in 1943 until Germany's surrender in 1945, these two generals waged war against each other with the same intensity they brought to fighting the Nazis. The sabotage was systematic and mutual. Montgomery lobbied Allied command to reduce Patton's fuel allocations, arguing that Third Army's aggressive advances were logistically unsustainable. Translation: starve Patton's army so it can't move faster than Montgomery's. Patton spread rumors through press contacts that Montgomery was afraid to fight and more concerned with casualties than victory. Montgomery deliberately delayed joint operations if Patton would receive public credit. Patton called Montgomery a tired little fart in official communications that had to be censored before reaching British command. Staff officers on both sides spent more time managing their generals' egos than planning operations. Eisenhower's diary from this period is filled with entries about reconciling Monty and Georgie and preventing another publicity disaster. Allied unity, the foundation of everything, was being corroded daily by two men who couldn't control their pride. The ultimate act of pettiness came in March 1945. Both generals planned competing Rhine River crossings, the last major obstacle before Allied forces could drive into Germany's heartland. Montgomery spent weeks preparing an elaborate set-piece assault. Massive artillery bombardment, coordinated airborne drops, extensive engineering support, and, critically, full media coverage. This would be Montgomery's moment, his triumphant crossing broadcast to the world. Patton learned about Montgomery's timeline and immediately ordered his own crossing for 24 hours earlier. No elaborate preparation, no media fanfare, just assault boats, darkness, and speed. His staff officers protested. The crossings weren't adequately reconnoitered. Surprise was worth more than preparation. They'd take unnecessary casualties. Patton didn't care about casualties. He cared about beating Montgomery. Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22nd with minimal resistance and light casualties. Patton's tactical gamble worked perfectly. But instead of celebrating a victory over the Germans, Patton held a press conference where he urinated into the Rhine River and sent a radio message to Eisenhower. "I pissed in the Rhine before Monty." That's where the feud had gone. Strategic river crossings, operations that should have been coordinated for maximum effectiveness, turned into publicity stunts designed purely to humiliate a rival. The goal wasn't defeating Germany. The goal was making sure the other guy looked worse. Why does this rank number 1? Duration, scope, and strategic impact. Military historians estimate that coordination failures between Montgomery and Patton, driven primarily by mutual sabotage, extended the European war by 2 to 3 weeks and cost approximately 8,000 to 10,000 Allied casualties that professional cooperation could have prevented. This wasn't pettiness measured in delayed promotions or withheld intelligence. This was pettiness that affected theater-wide strategy for 2 years and nearly broke Allied command itself. By March 1945, the Montgomery-Patton feud had become so destructive that it reached the desks of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. Two men with slightly more important things to worry about than whose general got to a river first. Classified cables from this period, declassified decades later, revealed just how close Allied command came to complete collapse. These weren't polite suggestions or diplomatic requests. These were direct threats from heads of state to their own generals. Stop the public warfare or lose your commands. Churchill's cable to Montgomery, dated March 25, 1945, minced no words. The alliance cannot survive continued public disputes between senior commanders. You will cease all press commentary regarding American operations, or I will have no choice but to recommend your relief to His Majesty's government. Roosevelt's message to Patton, sent through Eisenhower the same week, was equally blunt. Your recent statements and actions have embarrassed this nation and jeopardized Allied unity at a critical moment. Consider this your final warning. These weren't idle threats. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had already privately discussed replacing their generals. British cabinet minutes show Churchill seriously considering relieving Montgomery of command and appointing General Alexander in his place. American Joint Chiefs of Staff documents reveal contingency plans for promoting Bradley to theater command if Patton had to be removed. The fact that replacement plans existed at all, with Germany on the brink of collapse, with victory weeks away, shows how catastrophically the feud had damaged Allied operations. Eisenhower, caught in the middle, was on the verge of resignation. His private letters from March 1945 described the Montgomery-Patton situation as the worst crisis of my command and more difficult than any German offensive. He'd spent 2 years trying to manage their egos, mediate their disputes, and prevent their personal hatred from destroying operational effectiveness. By spring 1945, he was ready to quit and let someone else deal with it. The estimated cost of this 2-year vendetta goes beyond the Rhine crossing publicity stunt. Military historians analyzing coordination failures, delayed operations, and suboptimal resource allocation have calculated that professional cooperation between Montgomery and Patton could have shortened the European war by 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 3 weeks doesn't sound like much, until you calculate casualties. In March 1945, Allied forces were suffering approximately 2,000–3,000 casualties per week in combat operations. The Germans were killing Allied soldiers at roughly the same rate they'd maintained since Normandy. Steadily, efficiently, desperately. Conservative estimates put the unnecessary death toll from the Montgomery-Patton feud at 8,000 to 10,000 Allied soldiers. Men who died in battles that should have already been won. Operations that should have finished weeks earlier if two generals had been capable of acting like professionals instead of jealous rivals. That's the emotional peak of this entire ranking. Victory over Nazi Germany, the most important military objective of the 20th century, was nearly lost not to Hitler's armies, but to the egos of Allied commanders who couldn't tolerate sharing credit. Think about that. The Third Reich, with all its industrial capacity and military fanaticism, couldn't stop the Allies. But two generals hating each other almost did. Churchill and Roosevelt understood what was at stake. Their interventions in March 1945 weren't about military protocol or chain-of-command etiquette. They were emergency measures to prevent Allied command from imploding 3 weeks before Germany's surrender. The threats worked. Montgomery and Patton stopped the public press conferences. They ceased the open insults. They maintained professional communications for the final weeks of the war, but they never stopped hating each other. That hatred was permanent, absolute, and so deeply personal that even victory couldn't diminish it. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Germany has surrendered. The war is over. Allied commanders gather for official victory ceremonies, photographs for the history books, handshakes that will be reproduced in textbooks for generations. Montgomery and Patton are positioned next to each other for a photograph. The image still exists in archives. Two generals in dress uniforms, standing rigid, hands clasped in what's supposed to represent Allied unity and shared triumph. According to every witness present, they didn't speak a single word to each other. Their aides had to physically position them for the photograph. The handshake lasted exactly as long as the camera shutter required. The moment the photographer finished, both generals stepped away without acknowledgement, without eye contact, without any pretense that their hatred had diminished even slightly. Even in victory, even after defeating Nazi Germany, their contempt was absolute. That photograph is the perfect symbol for everything we've covered in this ranking. These 6 feuds weren't anomalies or exceptions. They were exactly what happens when you give enormous power to men whose egos matter more than their missions. Slim and Stilwell, Eisenhower and Patton, Bradley and Montgomery, Patton and Bradley, Montgomery and Patton. Every pairing followed the same pattern: pride, jealousy, retaliation, body count. We celebrate these men as heroes. We name bases after them, write biographies about their tactical genius, teach their strategies in military academies. All of that is deserved. They were brilliant commanders who won battles and ultimately won the war. But we also need to remember what they cost. The soldiers who died of malaria while generals argued over press coverage. The paratroopers who jumped into German tanks because intelligence was deliberately delayed. The casualties at Normandy that might have been prevented if America's best armor commander hadn't been sidelined for a year. The rescue mission that failed because a general needed to prove his worth. The relief force that arrived 3 days late because humiliating arrival mattered more than saving lives. 8 to 10,000 Allied soldiers, conservative estimate, killed not by German bullets, but by the pettiness of their own commanders. Here's the question we should be asking. How many of these men would have survived if their generals had acted like professionals? How many letters home were never written because someone's ego got bruised in Sicily? How many families got telegrams that started with, "We regret to inform you," because a promotion was blocked or intelligence was delayed or a rescue was postponed? We'll never know the exact number, but we know it wasn't 0. These feuds prove something uncomfortable about leadership and human nature. Brilliance doesn't eliminate pettiness. Tactical genius doesn't cure jealousy. You can be smart enough to outmaneuver Rommel and still be petty enough to let soldiers die over a newspaper headline. The greatest threat to an army isn't always the enemy across the battlefield. Sometimes it's the narcissist in the command tent who can't tolerate someone else getting credit. So here's my question for you. Which of these 6 feuds shocked you most? Did you know about the intelligence blackout at Market Garden? The deliberate delay at Bastogne? The promotion war that led to Hammelburg? Drop a comment and let me know. Because these stories didn't make it into most history textbooks, and they should have. And if you want more World War II history that challenges what you thought you knew, hit that subscribe button right now. We're covering the classified feuds, the censored cables, and the uncomfortable truths that get left out of the official narratives. History didn't tell you this story. We just did.